Hi YouTubers, this is another video from your friendly neighborhood reviewer Evelyn. Today we're going to be reviewing episode 5 of Interview with the Vampire, the AMC series that has adapted Anne Rice's books. If you want an explanation about what the series is about and what it entails and how it connects to the books and the movie, please see the thumbnail here. And also I've done a playlist of the episodes I've reviewed so far. So episode 5 is the continuation of the aftermath of having Claudia, the child vampire, now already maturely grown up in the mind of, let's say, mid-20s, but still stuck in the body of a girl of 14, neither a woman or girl, so stuck in between the stage, and how Claudia in this time setting has gone crazy as trying to deal with how to handle being stuck as a child forever. So episode 5 opens up with Daniel reading the Claudia's notebooks and realizing that she was killing people off and writing down their last words. And we also see at the same time that Daniel's seeing Louis feed off Rashid. In the last episode, our video that I did, I speculated whether Rashid was a vampire, but in this episode we can clearly see not. The main themes of episode 5 is the mystique of this gothic romance, the facade, everything breaking down suddenly. And the episode gets really heavy in some of the topics. To be aware, like with all books, it mirrors real life. It becomes a metaphor, an analogy, not so healthy relationships. So as Daniel's reading the books, he's essentially becoming the voice of people that haven't read the books and they're seeing this series for the first time and trying to understand this really weird setup of a toxic relationship between these two guys. So he's calling the BS on everything, but also Rashid is there acting as the intermediate for Louis, reminding Louis to keep his temper in check. And also Louis is there, making Daniel more and more aware of who he's playing with, as he clearly starts reading Daniel's thoughts. When Louis tells Daniel how Rashid tastes like honey and something else, and Daniel's like, don't read my mind, but Louis still does it anyway. So Louis' predator side of being a vampire is coming out a bit more in this episode, because we have to bear in mind right now Louis is probably the same age Lestat was when Lestat made him all those, hundreds of years ago. So we can see that Louis is more in the same time-wise of how Lestat was back then. We can also see that Daniel clearly doesn't like Rashid whatsoever. That I don't know. Louis goes and says, if you want to know how Rashid tastes like, and then Daniel goes and jokingly says, I'll wait for, what's the other guy's name? Tamric, something like that. The guy that was like Eastern European. And he goes into, and Rashid's like, I wouldn't let you near my own blood whatsoever. But Daniel's like, refill on the empty cup of coffee. We can see why I can understand why Louis feels attracted to Daniel in a sense, with his humor, and we can say maybe a blind sense of bravery that Daniel doesn't really care what's gonna happen to him, because of course Daniel is suffering from Parkinson's. So we can assume that at this point he wants to make his life a bit more meaningful. His first and last chance to go on the supernatural side. So as we move on to the episode, we see the aftermath of what's happened with Claudia, and Louis starts describing, back in that time, he thought that Claudia went on a hunger strike because she apparently didn't come out from her coffin. But on the other hand, Lestat sees the reality and he tells Louis that she's obviously going out when none of us are here at the house and, feeding on people. But Louis doesn't really want to believe that, so Lestat goes and opens up Claudia's coffin, and so it's clearly she's not there. So when they both see that Claudia's diaries are in the coffin, Lestat picks up one of the diaries and Louis says in vain not to read Claudia's diaries, is private. And then when Lestat goes and starts reading a page from Claudia's diary, Claudia starts talking about each time when they're intimate with a man, that whether she's going to be forever a virgin. You fill out the pieces of each time being a virgin, or every single time that she has a sexual interaction, and this puts off Lestat greatly. And also we get a callback when in the diaries Claudia compares with what's going on downstairs to her hair. Each time that she cuts off her hair, it grows back. That harkens back to the book and also the film, in the film Claudia's much more younger, this one in the book, by 8 or 9. And at that point, after about 100 years after, Claudia's already of a mind of a woman, and she goes and confronts Louis and Lestat about them being stuck in a child forever. And also within the episode, we see that Claudia wants to make another vampire a companion for herself. Of course, she's clearly lonely, and she goes and confronts that issue to the both of them. So the poignant scene within the episode, well, there's many, where when Claudia comes back into the house after killing a guy, Lestat is hiding in her coffin, so when she opens up the coffin, Lestat jumps out as well as Louis, and they both confront her for her lying, and also what they read in the diary that Lestat interprets that Claudia was being ungrateful about her guardians, and we see Lestat taking the charge in the conversation. As where Louis is silent, we see that Louis is playing the dad/mother figure, while Lestat is playing the domineering father. There's parts within this episode that we need to remember. In episode 1, where Lestat briefly talked about his childhood, he talked about how he was beaten up by his father and his brother. So of course, Lestat being a child of abuse, he mirrors that behavior with any relationship that he may have. Like, this episode kind of sees how abused people mirror what happened to them as a child or in their life with current relationships. This will not excuse Lestat's behavior by all means, and of course we have to see that this is multiplied tenfold because all of them are vampires here, all 3 of them. So Louis and Lestat confront Claudia and they say, you've killed like a dozen people. Where have you buried the bodies? Because Louis and Lestat are particularly worried about their identities being exposed, and of course their vulnerability of the sunlight being in the daytime, they'll be burned. And then both of them are fearful that if they've been put in jail, that they'll just end up dying. So Claudia tells them that she buried the bodies outside of their area, and when Louis asks where, and Claudia says Clementine, Louis then says, what happens when the sea level rises? The bodies will appear. So that's what's happened. So Louis and Lestat go to one of the underground drinking places, because around that time was the time of the Prohibition, where the government made alcohol illegal. So people were having, like they say, speakeasies, where they have an underground drinking club. So Louis and Lestat goes and confronts the mayor in the drinking club, and they find out that the police are looking for the killer, because they find out that the bodies had certain parts of the limbs dismembered, in which we can see the connection as with the original film and the book, that Claudia is obsessed with trying to imagine herself in a much older body, understandably, but of course it doesn't condone the type of killing that she does. So when Louis and Lestat are there interrogating this politician that they have in their wallet, Lestat tells Louis, you take one and I take the other, and we see in the scene that Lestat hypnotizes the mayor and I think everybody, but at the same time they find out that the police are in their house and Claudia is there. She looks drunk, but we found out that she was she consumed the blood of this alcoholic guy, so she was feeling the effects. So it was somewhat of a funny scene, but somewhat tragic, in which Claudia is hiding the evidence while the policemen are there looking in both of Lestat and Louis' house and saying why they have an incinerator. And Louis makes up some lie that they sell incinerators around the country. So when the police officers leave, and of course they threaten Louis and Lestat, because of course at that time homosexuality was illegal, and in terms they would imprison you in that time. They tell Claudia, why are you bringing souvenirs in the house? Because Claudia was hiding a full-grown body, and Claudia basically tells them that she was wanting to have another companion for herself. This particular argument that Louis and Lestat have was that they had this child together, as I said I titled my previous video The Birth of Claudia, but Lestat in reality only turned Claudia for Louis. Lestat didn't want Louis to leave. Claudia was the only thing at that time that Lestat saw could keep Louis close to them. But Claudia goes and gives a valid point saying, who's my Louis? Who's my Lestat? Who have I got to love? You two have each other. So this argument is what breaks up the family. Claudia leaves, and Louis doesn't really forgive Lestat for pushing the issue of Claudia leaving. And of course, before Claudia leaves, she tells Louis, how come I was somewhat alive at the time when you saved me. How come you never took me to the hospital? And Louis tries in vain to say that he only did what he thought was right. Also, before when Claudia leaves, Claudia reveals to Louis, with Lestat present, that she had been following Lestat and he was seeing another woman. So this really mirrors real life in a sense where one partner is not all the way in the relationship and neglecting the other, and the other partner goes off and tries to find somebody that gives him the attention. We see that Lestat is looking for somebody to love, but he's going in all the wrong places. And within the episode when Claudia leaves, we get put back to the present, in which Louis tells Daniel that essentially they made her out of guilt and remorse. And Daniel gives the most crudest remarks, saying of how we like to glamorize serial killers, aka what's going on with Jeffrey Dahmer. I saw the documentary, I won't see the fictional series on Netflix because that's no interest to me. And Daniel presents the case. Daniel really is the speaking board for the 21st century, 2022. How we portray serial killers, the the glamorization, the romanticism, the media and the TV put about it, and how the audience will pick it up. Louis doesn't want to hear it. He believes truly that Daniel could put in a context in which won't be exploitative, but Daniel compares Claudia to Charles Manson, the infamous serial killer. But Louis is very insistent, and he tells Daniel to read more. So when Claudia leaves, Louis says that they spent 7 years in hiding, him and Lestat. And on those 7 years, Lestat and Louis' relationship dramatically declines. The house that was once taken care of by Louis is now in shambles. Louis is just reading books off Lestat's shelf, while Lestat is there doing his own thing. And not knowing how to communicate with Louis in a sense. Because of course Lestat has the ego as big as this and more. He is patiently waiting for either Louis to have a change of heart, to say, okay, let's forget about Claudia. But as where Louis is out every day sending telepathic messages to Claudia for her to come back home, that he's sorry. But as where Claudia is out maturing herself out the big wide world, that she's trying to learn more about vampires because Claudia wants to understand about her existence as a vampire and if there's any more. So during her travels going to different universities, obviously killing people and researching, she encounters another vampire that goes and intervenes where these white jocks are there, like these white athletic guys, whatever, is there harassing her. This vampire, I was trying to think, Armand, another one, but his name is Bruce, this vampire, this unassuming guy, Bruce. So Bruce interrupts and they end up killing the guy that's in the university, the white guy, and they have a conversation around the campfire when they start talking about who they are in a sense. Bruce talks about how he was in the car manufacturing company of Henry Ford, in which he met his maker. And Claudia goes and asks how his maker was like. And he says, European. We don't know whether this could be Lestat as well, God knows. We have to assume maybe it's a different vampire. And this is the moment Claudia realizes the dangers of what Lestat was talking about. She gets assaulted, quite a bit. And then we get shifted to the present, in which Daniel talks about there's 4 pages missing from Claudia's diary. Daniel asks Louis, I don't think Claudia is the type to rip out pages from her diary. And then Louis, we see throughout this conversation, Louis has this big stress, and he's there digging into the table with his vampire nails that more look like talons. And Louis tells Daniel, I don't need to fill out the blanks for you. You can imagine the rest. But then Daniel tells Louis, you can't editorialize this story. It has to be what it is. And then Louis is basically saying, I'm not going to exploit Claudia. This bit, Daniel clearly should have known Claudia was Louis' daughter in all shapes and forms. It's difficult to talk about finding out if your daughter was sexually violated. And to have that told to the world, Louis couldn't bear the thought of that. And then Daniel digs further and I wouldn't say antagonizing. He starts describing the last words before the pages were torn off. And he was about to continue when Louis snaps in that moment. We can see at this point again that Louis has reached a certain strength level of Lestat than when they were together all those years back. He mind controls Daniel and gets him to involuntarily move his arms up and down. And we can see the fear finally in Daniel's eyes. Before things got out of hand, of course, Louis was also saying, I'm not going to repeat myself. Rashid strides in and puts his hand on Louis' shoulder. And that what makes Louis, snap out and realize that he's taking things too far. And Rashid starts talking for Louis, saying that Louis apologizes for his outburst. He finds it difficult to talk about Claudia. Then Rashid says Louis will be happy to continue the interview, and we can see Rashid's finding this situation awkward as well. Daniel stands up and slaps Louis, and then of course Louis doesn't feel anything, and then Louis looks at him with more predator eyes. In this bit, I can see why Louis has this attachment to Daniel. It's where Daniel has this fearlessness that even though he's talking to the most dangerous creature he's ever met, that Daniel doesn't care. That he's willing to confront Louis and the whole mysticism of vampirism for what it is. Now that bit is very important, is Daniel is establishing the boundaries of Louis and reminding him that just because you're a vampire, there are certain limitations you have to impose yourself when you're conversing with a human. So they carry on, and Daniel says, we're still recording. And he tells Louis to carry on talking. So when Louis does carry on talking, we see that Louis and Lestat's relationship, now we go back to the past, that Lestat is trying in vain to engage with Louis. He wants to move on from Claudia, but Louis is not having none of that because Louis really does love Claudia a lot as a daughter. So in the scene in which Claudia finally realizes her worth to Louis, the reason that Louis brought Claudia into her life is when Louis receives a phone call from his sister. Many years have passed, and he goes to the graveyard and he finds out his sister has declared, I think, Louis legally dead, because we see that he has his name right next to his mother's name. Louis' sister basically tells Louis, we need to move on. I don't want anything from you, because they're moving on since of the depression that has wiped out all their money. And she basically tells Louis that you're not my brother. Something took over my brother, but you're not my brother any longer. And in the conversation that Louis has with his sister is basically to let Louis know that they've declared him dead. They'll have no further contact whatsoever with him. Claudia's there spying on this, and Louis is devastated at the news. Louis goes back to the house. He's there very depressed. Claudia comes back and Louis is very happy to see Claudia. He's basically telling Claudia, oh, thank you for coming back. And Claudia is there just saying, that she's happy to be back. And Lestat is there. And Lestat sarcastically says, the prodigal daughter has returned. And Claudia goes and tells Lestat, I come here to apologize. I'm sorry for putting both of you in a bad spot. I wasn't right in my mind. In this scene, Claudia comes out very mature. She's understanding of the situation, and she's the most level-headed one of, honestly, between Louis and Lestat. But Lestat, in his childishness, doesn't accept Claudia's apology. Instead, he says, I don't accept it. And Claudia, I think she kind of knew that Lestat wouldn't, say, okay, wouldn't agree. In this bit, I do wonder if Lestat would have said, okay, like, let's be together. Maybe things would have been a bit more easier. But Claudia then goes and says, okay, you don't accept my apology. I clearly see 7 years have passed and nothing has happened, nothing has changed. And then Lestat also does tell Claudia, how has it been in these different universities? He starts listing all these different fraternity houses' names. And Claudia says that she's been there investigating about vampires. And Lestat basically tells Claudia, you've just been, looking at fairy tales. Claudia goes and tells Lestat, well, if none of this is real, tell me the truth. And Lestat doesn't answer. In this episode, we finally see Lestat's somewhat of his real face and his real potential. And Claudia goes and tells Lestat, oh, that means you don't know. You have no idea about the rest of the vampires. But Lestat says the rest of the vampires are vicious. They'll tear you apart because of how we made you, how fragile you are. And then Claudia goes and says, the only reason I've come back is to take Louis with me. And Lestat is furious when he hears that Claudia has said that. And he tells Claudia, she's just being ridiculous and stupid. And Claudia tells Louis, you see, this is what he does when he doesn't know and he's scared. He likes to ridicule people. Claudia and Louis are telepathically talking to each other. And Lestat is there out of desperation telling Louis, 1,000 nights of sulking and one night she comes back and you're ready to leave? I've been here all along. But Louis is just like dissociated from the situation. And Lestat goes and screams to Louis, he's like, so desperate, the amount of desperation. And then Claudia goes and says out loud, let's go to vampires and let's meet different vampires that can really love you. And this is what sets off the chain of events that's about to happen next. What I'm about to say now is people that might find these scenes triggering, because we have to remember these stories are an analogy for the writer's life. They're an analogy for real relationships when you're with somebody that's extremely controlling and also narcissistic. Lestat goes and tries to choke out Claudia, but Louis goes and tackles him. And then the both of them are having a scene where they're beating each other up, but Lestat is mostly winning because of his strength and age. We don't see much of the physical things because we see from the corner of the eyes where we can see clearly Louis being flung into the doors. Then Louis tries to battle Lestat, they go up the stairs and Claudia is there like screaming for them to stop. We can see that Louis is talking to Claudia telepathically and he tells Claudia, to stay back, they're just working things out. In that moment, I just felt really sad thinking that maybe Louis is mirroring his relationship, like his parents' relationship. We don't know how Louis' father was, because we can see a very typical of a domestic violence situation. In this scene, we can see the romanticism, everything, all the illusions of this fantasy being broken apart. I don't condone the situation with Lestat. It's much more different than how it is in the book because of the different situations. They flipped it on Claudia coming out as the more level-headed one. So basically, Lestat drags Louis' body by his throat and he tells Louis, I've been restraining myself for all these years, my anger. I've been here all along. And he basically tells Louis that he's had enough. And Claudia in vain tries to chase after them. She tries to call Lestat Uncle Les, and Lestat just laughs saying, right now I'm your uncle. And then Claudia's like, just let Louis go. He hasn't done anything wrong. The person that you want is me. Lestat tells Claudia, you have the situation all wrong. I didn't choose you. I chose him. And in that moment, we see Lestat's somewhat of more of his potential, his power. He goes and bites into Louis and Lestat flies up into the sky with Louis. That bit I was like, oh, we knew that Lestat has the power of flight as many vampires, but we see how much that Lestat was really maybe hiding. But then again, that doesn't condone the violation that he did with Louis. If you love somebody so much, you try to understand them. We see that both Lestat has Louis in the sky and he's drinking his blood. It's an equivalent of a sexual violation to me. I don't know, how do you get past that in a sense? But then again, we're talking about vampires and immortality. They're in the sky. Lestat tells Louis, "You don't know how much I love you. And I've been waiting all along for you to tell me if you love me also." And Lestat tells Louis, "Just tell me that you don't love me. Make it easier." He's almost telling Louis, just tell me you don't love me and I can feel less guilty or maybe of killing you. But the only thing that Louis says is just to let go of him. And Lestat just says sarcastically with a bit of pain in his voice, "Anything for you, Louis." And he drops Louis, hundreds of thousands of feet from the sky, and he ends up landing through the house. And Claudia sees Louis' broken and mangled body on the floor. And then we see that Lestat floats back down, and we see the fear in Claudia's eyes as the episode pans out. This episode has been very hard to watch. It's to see the reality of the situation of what we can say maybe a real marriage, the years of being together, of how crumbles. And of course, Lestat didn't exactly take the time to find out more about Louis' interests or what he wants. The only way that Lestat's compromise was to really not do anything and say okay to some of the things that Louis wants. We could say that, their relationship wasn't exactly built on communication. It was built more on wants and desires instead of really looking at how both individuals were. Also within the episode, we see that Rashid does tell Daniel that this book is a way for maybe Louis to end his life. The expectation is that other vampires would read the book and try to come and kill Louis. This episode has been very hard to talk about. The first episode was like, the fantasy, the drama, the love, but it's just in this episode everything just got broken apart. Sam Reed did a fantastic performance in this part, and then we see also Jacob Anderson, another fantastic performance of these two actors, these two individuals, to bring both sides to the story. So we made it to the end. There was quite a lot to talk about, a very powerful episode. If you made it to the end, a big thank you. Appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button to any new viewers and to any new subscribers and existing ones. Thank you very much for watching. Leave your comments down below as to your feelings towards this episode. The promo for the next episode will see some of the repercussions of what happened in that very violent night. But as I leave you always, bye.